Richard Diaz, we are going to hop right into this, my friend. So, you've been vocal about Canada's economic challenges like declining GDP per capita and housing affordability. What is the most critical policy change needed to reverse these trends coming up after this election?
I get this a lot. How's it going, first of all? You're doing all
Good,
right?
man.
It's
Good.
nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too. You too.
Um, Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, man, it's too funny. What do you see as the most critical policy change needed to reverse trends like declining GDP per capita and housing affordability?
I think those are two separate questions. I think housing affordability has been destroyed in two ways. The first was keeping interest rates negative, so meaning below inflation for a decade, starting with Mark Carney and then perpetuated by the central bankers that came after. That fueled a speculative bubble, obviously egged on by the banks that make lots of money on mortgage origination, and the Canadians who absolutely share plenty of blame for that. Um, and yeah, so that's and that will and then the second part of that is obviously population growth. I mean, the tripling of the population growth almost exclusively via immigration is probably one of the worst policy mistakes that's been perpetrated on young and working class people, I think, ever probably in the history of Canada. People will blame the provinces, and I think that that's a really, really convenient scapegoat. But the reality is that, this started in 2015. And and more importantly, the federal government is the one that stamps the visas. And when it became clear that it was out of control around 2022, and this is, by the Bank of Canada started talking about it. Other people, there was there was lots and lots of people discussing it. I came around the problem around that time too. People, they were derided and etc. But you can't have immigration, and so let's say the housing demand or be 3 or 4x the number of houses available. I mean, that's just, it's a very straightforward supply and demand. So how do we get around that? I think really slowing down immigration to something that's much more measured, and in line with our needs of our economy, rather than just sort of this open border policy, and then getting out of the way of housing, of household supply. And I don't mean silliness with like governments getting into building houses. That's a stupid idea. What I mean is just really relying on the recommendations from the Bank of Canada again, which published a short little report in the July 2024 monetary policy report. You can go look it up. It's box 3, very specific, where they outline the fact that it's zoning, NIMBYism, permitting, all these issues basically around why it takes so long and why it's so expensive to build homes. And they talked about it long before it became politicized. So I would recommend people to check that out. And then as far as my policy prescriptions with around capital, I mean, and so that's the other problem. I think you mentioned capital, but that's one of the big issues with Canada is that we have a really terrible, terrible productivity growth. And one of the reasons we have really terrible productivity growth is that we are not investing in, or there's not enough gross fixed capital formation. And gross fixed capital formation comes in several ways, in several measures or different types. There are different types of gross fixed capital formation. There's like intellectual property products, like software, research and development. There's non-residential spending or non-residential structures, equipment, machinery, plants, obviously. Then there's residential stuff. And so basically on all of those measures, barring the intellectual property, we just aren't spending as much. And we're not spending as much because of two reasons. One, Canada's a difficult place to invest. And two, people are going elsewhere. Canadians specifically are going elsewhere and investing elsewhere. So we got to do something to turn that around, whether it's tax cuts, making streamlining regulation. I don't know. I don't know that part. Oh, I mean, being welcome to the oil and gas sector and natural resources and mining, and really changing our attitudes towards that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that was a good answer. So you said pipelines. There's two
Yeah,
pipelines that I've kind of jumped into and learned more about during this Orange Man bad time.
sure.
And obviously, for people that don't know the reference, it's basically Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So a lot of the oil goes from the crude oil, the good stuff goes from Alberta down Line 5 into the States. And then it comes back up to Ontario and then Quebec. And that's kind of how they get their energy, right?
Yeah,
I've nailed that. Okay. So there's two pipelines that Canada decided not to build, the Northern Gateway Pipeline
that's
and
right.
Energy East. So
That's right.
the reason why is because there was a lot of people protesting it, but Alberta isn't quite centrally located, but it's not close to any ocean where they can then send these barrels of crude oil to other customers. So we've basically handicapped ourselves to having one customer being America.
Absolutely.
So if Pierre Poilievre gets in, let's just say it, and he starts building these pipelines and allowing for the pipelines to get built, would that help our GDP per capita? Would that expand us to become more energy independent, where we're sending crude oil to the Pacific Ocean, which then gives us access to Asia, and then the Atlantic Ocean, which is Eastern Canada, which gives us access to Europe? Did I get that right?
Yeah, so let's I think we need to measure our expectations with respect to finding new markets for oil. I think it's a great soundbite. It's ironic now that certain political parties, after spending the last 10 years doing everything they could to destroy the oil and gas industry in this country, are sort of jumped on the winning team here. So that's a positive. But even if we have all the pipelines east to west, I think America would still be the vast where the vast majority of our oil goes. So Canada produces about 5 million barrels of oil a day, and we send about, I think I'm looking at the chart right now, about 95, whatever, 96% of our oil goes there. I think if you have all the pipelines from west to east you want, I still think that number is going to be, very high, let's just say. And it's going to be very high because they're a huge consumer of oil. And there's already an incredible amount of infrastructure in place to absorb and then turn it into a value added good, and then to sell that product on. So that's a really important factor. The second factor I think that's really important is that Canada has very limited refining capacity. So we produce 5 million or 4 or 5 million barrels a day, let's say closer to 5 million barrels a day. We internally consume about 2 and a bit, and we have basically roughly the same amount of refining capacity. So in conjunction with pipelines, we would need to refine that oil domestically if we really wanted to sort of be energy quote unquote independent, because that's the problem, right? Or maybe the problem, or maybe it's a good thing, who knows? But the fact is, we send crude oil south, they refine it in places like Cushing's, Oklahoma, and then another northern states, and then they basically ship it up north. Yes, I know that they refine some in Alberta, but broadly speaking, though, that's how the math works. And so, yeah, it's not just pipelines; it's refining capacity as well. Does that make sense? Because
Yeah.
crude oil is, just so people understand, crude oil is great, but we produce heavy crude, and heavy crude has all kinds of industrial applications. But what we burn is something called gasoline, as people are familiar with. Most cars in Canada are gasoline. Big trucks use diesel, and that's out of a refining process. And then so we would need those two in conjunction to really sort of quote unquote separate ourselves from the American industrial or energy complex.
Do you think either party is going to commit to this? Because I was looking at the numbers and it looks like to get to Alberta for the Northern Gateway, it's about 25 billion. And then to get the Energy East pipeline, it would be about $100 billion. I guess where does that money come from?
Well,
Um,
investors invest. I mean, I don't think
Investors.
the government should be involved in this at all. This should be a
Okay.
private sector undertaking. I think the reason that the Canadian government has had to step in is because we have actively discouraged private sector investment. So, for example, there's been, I think, the Energy East, there had been almost $1 billion committed to doing all the pre-building work. So you have to do all of the engineering, the surveying, getting people on board, all the marketing shtick. Like, there's all kinds of work you need to do before you put a shovel in the ground. And the problem with not just oil, but a problem with so many projects, and I would argue it's probably the same in real estate as well, which is the permitting is completely you how do I say this? You have no visibility on permitting. You have no visibility with respect to not only are you going to be able to do it, green light it, or green light or red light, but also on the time, how much time it will take to get permitting. There's all kinds of sort of hurdles, and those hurdles for the energy sector in particular have getting higher and higher and higher and higher. So one of the major reasons that Canada's had to step in is because this Canadian government has spent the last 10 years basically telling people we don't want their money. And so let's just understand one another. The counter argument to that will be like, well, oil prices have fallen, and it's no longer economically viable. And I'd say, okay, so let companies risk their own capital, and if they go bankrupt, they go bankrupt. But it's I don't think it's the government's job to decide how investors win or lose their money. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that may have been true 10 or 15 years ago when the break-even barrel of the oil sands was in the 70s or 80s bucks a barrel. But oil sands break-evens, so how much money you need to sell your oil barrel to make the project profitable, has collapsed. We're in the 40s. I've seen numbers like 43. I could be wrong. Be happy to someone shares some data that's different to that. So the break-even barrel of oil that you need for Canadian oil sands to be profitable, much, much, much lower than it used to be. And the second thing that I think is really important, all this bullshit about, pardon my French, but all this BS about how it's, the oil industry is going the way of the dodo bird. I mean, that's just that's just factually incorrect for two reasons. One, the world is consuming more and more crude oil. So we burn about 104 million barrels of oil per day globally. Yes, the energy share of total energy, the fossil fuel share of total energy consumption is falling, but the absolute number continues to rise. And then a critical thing that Canadians may not know if you're not plugged into this world is the Permian Basin and other parts of the US shale energy complex, or whatever you want to call it, are starting to lose productivity. Does that make sense? So It was extremely successful. That's what brought the US from 4 million barrels of oil a day to 13 million barrels a day. But we're starting to see the kind of, not the end of this supply, but those wells are becoming increasingly less productive, and they're having to spend more and more money to get, they're having to squeeze the lemon more and more to get the same amount of juice. Whereas Canada has the third largest oil reserves in the world, 168 billion barrels of oil, right? So, and our visibility on that is much, much, much more straightforward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So with all this talk about oil, and the US has said they want to become energy independent, we don't need Canada's oil. We all know what he said. Yeah,
but that's not happening. That's not happening. But people need to understand why it's not happening. So that's not happening not because he's bad or we're good or what. It's just purely the way, the way God created the earth. Okay, for lack of a better way of forming it, it's like they have lots and lots of oil, but oil is not. It's not just, I know commodity, the word commodity means that it's fungible, but that's not really true. It's not strictly true. There's things called heavy crude and there's things called light crude. Now, I'm not an oil energy expert. I know just enough to get in trouble, but fundamentally, the US does not have enough heavy crude oil to meet its both transportation and industrial needs. Okay, so they do produce a little bit of heavy crude oil, but they produce mostly something called light sweet crude, which is the same as you get in Saudi Arabia, as an example. And that light sweet crude is very useful for things like gasoline or whatever, but for other industrial applications, you need the heavy crude. So it's called a higher gravity is the language. Again, I know just enough to get in trouble. But the point is that mix is what's vital, all right? And so you need the heavy crude, which is why all these companies have spent the last 30 or 40 years building pipelines, not for fun. And they were doing it because they need the product. And so the US needs the heavy to mix with its light And then with that and the magic of refining, then you can get the suite of products that we know and love and use every day and to sustain life on this planet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. And this is kind of a facetious question, but you know how
I
the
love
media,
those. Go for it.
you know how the media spins it. Donald Trump is here to wreck our economy, or have we put ourselves by crappy policy in the position that we're in? Has the last 10 years been because of policy rather than a guy who came in, a couple months ago and said he was going to put tariffs on Canada? What do you think about the whole back and
I
forth
mean,
thing?
I'm sure Donald Trump would love to take credit for all the problems that Canada has, and I'm sure that there's politicians in this country that cannot run on their record because their record is abysmal. And so it's been extremely politically expedient to sort of blame Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump were to disappear tomorrow, so many of the really critical and crucial structural problems that Canada has would be in place. Housing affordability housing unaffordability would not go away. The fact that we've invited millions of people into this country with no real thought or plan as to where they're going to live, where they're going to go to school, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. That would still be an issue. Declining capex per person. That's something called capital shallowing, which is related to the productivity emergency. Now, productivity emergency, those are not my words. Those are the words of the Deputy Bank of Canada Governor Carolyn Rogers that she said almost 13 months ago, excuse me. We have a research and development spending as a percentage of GDP is stuck at a 20-year low, roughly 25-year low. I can't remember now. Capital simply is now leaving Canada. So, it's not just, so there's lots of talk about foreign direct investment into Canada, and that's great. But Canadians are increasingly taking their money and going elsewhere. We have a tax take that's very, very high. Federal tax take as a percentage of GDP is at a 22-year high, if I'm not mistaken. The public sector productivity is at a 4-year, it has been declining for 4 years. It's at a 10-year low. So, I mean, all these problems, unemployment was rising before Donald Trump. If you were to snap your fingers and he'd disappear, it would probably still be rising, tomorrow. So I get it. Canadians are not a fan of his, but there were major structural issues in Canada that were in place, and I would argue encouraged to happen under this current administration and others. But it's been 10 years. It's a long time. It's a long time to be blaming the previous government. 10 years is a good amount of time because you have different political policies, or you have enough time for policies to sort of feed through. You might have a crisis or two. You might have a recession or two. So, those are real. That's a real amount of time where you can say, okay, these people, their idea on how to run the country has been, let's say, less than ideal. The question is, do we have the political will to really change course? Do we have, have people felt enough pain? Let's say. One more thing that I think is really interesting is sort of Canada's issue with intra-provincial trade barriers.
This one blows my mind.
So this is something that's really interesting. And again, this was known. So the paper that everybody's quoting, the paper could be wrong, paper could be right, but the paper that everybody seems to be quoting, including me, by the way, was written in 2019, and it's an IMF paper. I can't remember who wrote it, so forgive me. And what they do is they compare non-tariff trade barriers. And so basically what they do is they modeled out how much trade there is between provinces, how expensive or how difficult that is. They figured out a number. It's 21. Who knows if that number is right or wrong, but what matters to me is sort of the order of magnitude. And then when they compared each province with the United States, it was 3. Right. So effectively, we charge each other a 20% tariff, and we charge the US 3% tariff. This has been known for years.
It's just, and then who's paying it? It's just us, like us.
So yeah, it's difficult because it's often not an explicit tariff. Like, it's not explicit like a payment. Like, you don't see the number, you know what I mean, if you're an importer or whatever. But in effect, what they're trying to say is there's no free trade within Canada. Yeah. And so one of the ways that we can improve our productivity is telling the provinces to stop protecting cottage industries here and there and lean into free trade. And we actually, and what's really fun is we actually have an example of where this was tried and where it was successful. So Australia is like a really good corollary for Canada. I mean, it's a commodity driven economy. There's very few people, large land mass. All the people are sort of live in a very specific area, which is on the coast and mostly, frankly, on the East Coast. But you know what I mean? And so like everyone's basically there, and maybe a couple of people in Perth, but and so the it's a similar sort of thing to Canada, where like 40% of Canada's population, or some ridiculous number, maybe it's even higher, maybe it's around 60, live in 4 or 5 cities. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so the similar, and in the 90s, I think in the late 90s, Australia had this similar issue where there was lots of in Australia. They have states, they don't have provinces, but it's basically the same stuff. And they really, there was a real emphasis and focus on getting rid of those intrastate barriers. And there's loads of great papers that show that when you do that, guess what? The states start trading with one another. And when you trade, you improve efficiencies. And there's a real appreciable difference in your GDP and your productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one thing we could do to, whether, again, the focus on Donald Trump, I think is great for people who were down in the polls and have basically run this country into the ground. But even if he were to disappear, I think that so many of the problems that have been caused would still exist. I mean, the data is very, very clear on that.
Why do you think the older generation is so obsessed with this, the changing of the guard, right? You have Mark Carney coming in, and it seems like this guy has an impressive resume. I've looked at it. It just doesn't feel like it's the right fit for Canada, though, if that makes sense. Like his net zero policies doesn't seem right. His cabinet is all the same that Trudeau had. It just feels like a new face at the top, but very similar policies. Not only that, he was an economic advisor to Trudeau. Like for me, it just seems like we just need change, and it's such an obvious new pick. But then I get called all these terrible things on my Instagram for saying that, but I don't care. But I guess in your opinion, what's kind of the obsession? Because you had this epic rant, like not rant, you were so polite and so kind against that guy on the Loonie Hour. Everyone texts me about it. They're like, "Oh my God, this guy's amazing." But I just wanted to kind of like, what's the motive for the older generation to keep Carney in? What are they thinking?
I honestly, man, I don't know. I have like a couple of like reflexive answers, which is,
Too much CBC?
I mean, sure. I mean, I won't say
You won't
no
go
to
there.
that. I won't say no to that. I mean, I'm actually a fan of like state-funded broadcasters, especially if you live in rural communities. So that's, I mean, there's a couple of things I think that right off the top. One is that forgive me for saying this, but the media landscape is like brazenly and shamelessly behind the current group of politicians. I mean, I'm sorry, no one is going to tell me that they're not unbiased. It's to the point of it's almost embarrassing.
They think. Get money, like their job's on the line. Like
right. So
I can barely watch it.
In a way, I almost forgive them. I mean, I wish they had just a shred of journalistic integrity. Some more than others. There's, of course, I know it's totally unfair to paint it with a total brush, but come on, who are we kidding here? It's very obvious who they're pulling for. And I think that's right away, that's important, because I think we know that older people just simply are not on the Instagrams and the Twitters and whatever. I think there's a certain element of gray hair. I think that helps. I mean, let's be honest, when you're running a company, it's good to have somebody with gray hair on the board of directors to make you guys seem sophisticated and that you have experience or whatever. That's one element of it. I know people don't want to, maybe it's a bit reductive, and I apologize for that, but I kind of believe that's a bit of it. I think the other piece is that, frankly, most baby boomers have been completely and totally insulated from these policies and these disastrous policies, right? Because if you're an asset holder, so in Canada, it's about 65% of people own their own homes, okay? And if you're an asset holder, you've had probably the best. So if you own a home, let's say in Toronto or, or Montreal even, just use my mother as an example. She's an older lady. When she bought her flat's doubled. There are people who bought homes in Toronto 15, 20 years ago, their houses have tripled in value, right? You know, if you're older, you're established, you frankly have just been totally insulated, excuse me, from a litany of terrible policies, right? What you care is about your assets, not your income. What you care about is your retirement, not your prospects. And so, to me, that's really what's driving this schism. You know, I think this sort of bifurcation of Canadian politics and economics and the population. I think that's really where what it boils down to. It's like I speak to a lot. I don't speak to them. Excuse me. I get a lot of emails from young people who are just they feel like they're losing hope. They don't think that the prospects that are ahead of them are as good as they were from behind them. And you know, whereas if you're 60 or 70 years old, you don't really care, not in the same way. It doesn't inviting 3 or 4 million people in the span of 2 years doesn't affect you. It helps you. You know what I mean? And so it's just so I think that's it. I mean, what do you think? How do you feel? Why do you think there's such a bifurcation in the polls and in the sentiment around this?
I think you've nailed it. I think it's too much CBC. Like I watched it a lot, honestly, going up to the election and stuff like that. Like even before the polls changed and everything. And I just wanted to get another side to it. I watch mostly independent creators like you guys in the Loonie Hour and a few other people, and then it just got the bias is just too painful to watch. It's almost like there's a lot of lying that goes on, like a ton of lying. Even the comparison of Trump to Polyev is two totally different upbringings. It's not even
Well,
close.
that's asinine. I mean, they're not the same people at all.
But people fall for it. Sorry, my camera might have froze.
That's
But
okay.
people fall for it, which is crazy to me. And like you said, the asset thing. Their house goes up in value. Their RRSPs are up in value. There's all these assets that just keep going up and up and up. And then, a lot of, I guess, older women who aren't working anymore, no offense to them, they start going down this dangerous path of like misogyny, which I don't believe in, is happening with Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. Like, I've had so many people say that if you vote for the Conservatives, you're voting for World War II all over again, and that kind of thing. And
that's a new one.
It's an extreme take, because if you just ask ChatGPT what happened in World War II, you'll get a big sense of how many people actually died and how sad that is.
Well, I think that we can't. I mean, I don't know if we should relitigate that. I think World War II is pretty horrific. Ask the Russians and the Chinese, but and the Germans and the Jews and etc. But I mean, let's get this back on the rail. I mean, let's get this back on the rails. I think the other thing that I think really is another sort of fault line with respect to the Canadian electorate. Again, this is out of my scope. I'm not a political strategist, but so we talked about young, old. We talked about working class versus bourgeoisie, established, not established, homeowner, not homeowner. But the other thing is about sort of domestic versus global problem. Right? Like, I think thinking about global problems is a luxury belief, frankly. I know people might not like that, but when you're going hungry, you don't care about climate change.
Right.
When your standard of living is falling, you don't care about renewable energy. I think when you can't find a place for your kids to go to school, or hospital wait lines are at a 30-year high, or if crime is at a 10-year high, you're less interested in solving the problems that require global cooperation and coordination, frankly. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're rich, those are the things you think about.
That's a good point. It's almost like the division almost came from the division of wealth. People got too rich and then they made all this money, and then you have the poor people, like the younger people who aren't technically poor, but they just can't keep up. Their incomes can't keep up to house prices and rent and every metric you could bring up, because you're the stats guy. But it makes so much sense that the division almost is because of money, which then flows into politics.
Yeah. I mean, I think that show me an incentive and I'll show you a result is something I really think about a lot. And I think that when things are going really well for you, why are you going to vote the party out. I mean, it's really, to me, I think it really boils down to that. But the other thing I think about, what really mystifies me, just full stop, and you alluded to the point that's basically they've just swapped out one person for another person. Everybody else is the same. I think that's categorical. Although, in their defense, I think right now, I mean, the cabinet, I suspect will look different. If should Mark Carney win, I think his cabinet will look slightly different. That's, who knows. The thing I wanted to mention was that, like, to me, it's the data is just unequivocal, right? Like, there's I have thousands of charts on Canada, and I don't think that there's one in like critical economic data point that shows that we are better off today than we were yesterday. And so, at a fundamental level, like, do I think that Pierre Poilievre is the Lord and Savior who's going to come in and just fix every structural issue that has taken 10, 15 years to develop? No. But at a minimum, he won't be the people responsible for it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and so to me, like, I mean, that's not like I don't mean to disparage his platform ideas and his policy suggestions. I actually genuinely really like them. But let's just park that for a second. Like, you have a group of people who were in charge when Canada's GDP literally did not go up on a per capita basis, adjusted for purchasing power for 10 years. And you people don't. And like,
Yeah.
to me, as an economist, I'm just like, there's my choice. Like,
Yeah.
end of analysis, right? Like, so, and now that's like a very, very, if you talk about being reductive, like, that's, I mean, as reductive as you could possibly get. But I also think it's a meaningful way of thinking about things, right? Now, right? I mean, I don't know if you feel that way or maybe you don't. I'm just like, how could you give them like another chance? Like, how bad does it have to get for us to realize, or just to say, we're not going to reward these people, or we need a new set, we need new blood? Like,
Yeah.
and I will just say one more thing. A conversation I have with my mother, who's a baby boomer, and I'm like, if the roles were reversed, I would tell, hand on heart, I would say the exact same thing, which
Yeah.
is, if the blue team had been in charge when there's 10 years of economic malaise and we were last place, except for Luxembourg, on the 38 country OECD chart that's been going around, then I would just simply be like, okay, tough luck, blue team. I'm going for the other team. Do you know what I mean? And so that's, to me, that really fundamentally blows my mind. Like, this, I'm agnostic. You know what I mean? Ultimately, I don't care who's in charge. I just want there to be a vision, a positive, optimistic vision to improve the standard of living of working class people. And that's really, really my motivation when I think and talk about these things.
Yeah. I mean, it feels so simple, but I guess the like with the media just getting involved, it makes it feel so complicated. And like
Yeah.
you said, like if you look at every metric, like what's the saying, men lie, women lie, but numbers don't. And that's the honest truth, is that if you just compare your life to 2015, or you look at house prices in 2015, you're a millennial, you're my age, 35, whatever you are, and you just look at prices in 2015 to today, you would look at those 2015 prices and you would break your own
Yeah,
leg just to get those back if you
for
don't own a
sure.
house. So it's just
But like, in the
simple.
defense of the government, like, it's not just Justin Trudeau letting in millions of
For
people,
sure, for sure.
right? Like, the
It's red tape. Yeah.
central banks, Mark Carney has his own that. We did go through, COVID and the policies around that, printing infinite amounts of money, lying about the fact that inflation was transitory, like, the supply chain stuff. Yeah, I get it. I'm a big believer that it's never just one thing, right? So, and maybe I'm being a hypocrite because I was reductive on one hand, and now I'm being a little less reductive, trying to be more nuanced on the other hand. But so it's not just them, but like, when it comes, like, I don't want to just, like, energy policy to me is like a very important thing, right? And so is, the idea of exploiting our natural resources in an ethical and sustainable manner. I genuinely believe Canada could do this. And not only that, I think in a world where China controls, 60 to 90% of the critical minerals required to live in this world, we have to sort of own up to the fact that we have to do our part, right?
Yeah.
So China controls like 40% of the processing of copper, 40% of nickel, cobalt's in the 60s. I'm looking at the chart right now. Rare earth, they control 90%, and lithium another 60 or whatever. So, and what do you need to process those minerals? You need cheap, first of all, you need the minerals themselves. So check box for Canada. And you need cheap energy. Check box, right? And you need a customer. Well,
Pretty big.
the rest of the rest of the world would love to buy, our critical minerals.
Yeah.
For all kinds of reasons, either ethical or, strategic or whatever. And so, but we've gotten in the way. I mean, it's unequivocal. I mean, there's no sensible person can tell me that this past government has been encouraging mine building and pipelines and energy and whatever that they have actively, not only have they campaigned against it, but they bragged about it, right?
Mm. The carbon tax.
Yeah, I mean, the carbon tax is bananas, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I know it was insane. So when you said Canada does things ethically, and I think that's a big thing that people are missing is because we all share the same atmosphere. So it doesn't matter. The atmosphere doesn't care if Canada's polluting a little bit less than they were. They care that China and India have taken this huge role in burning coal, and they're still building coal plants. And
oh yeah, they've. Sorry to interrupt you, but
no, go.
India. Listen, if you think that emissions is the single most important thing that humans must tackle, then we should be building nuclear for days. Yes, renewables, fine. That's not my view, but let's assume that's part of the answer. And certainly the idea that natural gas to dislodge coal would be the third right option. I mean, I don't, what else is there? And places like China, where 60% of China's primary energy consumption comes from coal, China's building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. Okay, India, it's a poor country. They want to develop economically. They have doubled down on coal
because it's cheap energy, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's cheap energy, and the only way that you'd be able to dislodge coal, which is 50% worse in inverted commas than natural gas, is natural gas. It's the only real like for like substitute where it would be a relatively inexpensive and quick way to shift those coal-fired power plants into natural gas burning power plants. You'd lower emissions, and then you're on the path to lowering global emissions. But there was a bill recently that I can't remember the name of it, but Canada has basically prevented Canadian energy companies from talking about how natural gas is a good substitute for coal. Like that's crazy.
That's crazy. That's
right. Like
that's
literally,
like
right. Yeah. So that's crazy. So this is what I'm saying. So to me, back to the choice we have ahead of time, like ahead of us, is like let's just call it what it is. Like Mark Carney has spent the last 15 years trying to destroy the global oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
And people say, Rich, that language is too strong.
No, he wrote a book about it.
Yeah, he wrote a book about it, A. And then B, he started something called the Net Zero Banking Alliance.
Which every Canadian bank left, right?
Which every Canadian bank left. And ostensibly, the like raison d'etre of this Net Zero Banking Alliance was to starve oil and gas companies of capital.
So they're forced to.
So they want, if you starve somebody of capital, you're familiar with what happens, you die. And so that's what they were trying to destroy the oil and gas industry. And so for him to turn around and be like, oh yeah, we're going to champion, being energy independent. To me, it's
but how does that happen with his bill C-69? Like he says, we're going to, unleash resources in Canada. Wow. And then he says, well, I'm not going to do Bill C-60. I'm not going to remove Bill C-69, which people who aren't familiar with it, it's basically the no new pipelines bill. So if we don't have pipelines, what do we do?
Well, I mean, I don't know how you could. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. I think that's not just the new pipelines, by the way. It's the emissions cap. Right. So there's an emissions cap rule that they want to put on the oil and gas sector in Canada.
Which is basically on Alberta
I
maybe a
mean,
little
of
bit
course,
on
right?
Saskatchewan. That's why
It's
Danielle
Saskatchewan,
Smith is so,
Alberta.
yeah, she's so vocal.
So, and she's rightly pissed. And I think it's, I mean, besides the fact that it's probably not constitutional, let's just leave. I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea about that, but let's just leave that for a second. Like, they are not interested in the energy, oil and gas sector, and Canadians need to like come to terms with what we are.
Mhm.
We sell natural resources to buy consumer goods.
Isn't that
Yeah.
why you live in a cold climate?
Well, I mean, now you're getting into like existential questions why
Yeah.
anybody moves anywhere or lives anywhere. I mean, that's what we that's why you live in shitty places, right? Like
Mhm.
now let's step back a second. I don't think that that's will be true forever, like in 200 years from now, is Canada going to be solely centered and focused on exploiting natural resources? Maybe, maybe not. But right this second, it certainly is. And in the foreseeable future, it certainly is. And the other thing that people often forget, I think, is like it's not just pumping out oil so the US people can drive big dumb cars and whatever. That's a very like superficial understanding of the energy industry and energy market and the opportunities around energy. I mentioned critical materials. You need relatively cheap energy and loads of it to process minerals, to build steel and aluminum, to manufacture heavy industry, whether it's everything from ships to trinkets and everything in between. The other thing I think was people often forget is if you build it, they will come, right? So if you just create a world where there's an incredible amount of cheap energy available. Now, it doesn't have to be oil and gas. It could be nuclear power. It could be hydro. It could be whatever it is. But if you create a world where there's loads and loads and loads of cheap energy, those industries create themselves, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So like before, like one of the really amazing things about the fracking revolution in America is that it not only allowed the US to displace coal almost completely. Maybe by the end of this decade or next, the US will basically not use coal, despite Donald Trump's best effort to the contrary. And it's not because coal is bad or whatever, it's just they found a better substitute, and that substitute's natural gas. And it also, what it did is it lowered prices, full stop, of energy. It helped really, really push and keep low energy prices down. And it allowed companies to bring back manufacturing of all sorts in America.
Mhm.
And so we can do that, like another example, I think, is like, for example, hydrogen. Again, on this, trying to be, thinking about green, thinking about the future. In order to not create hydrogen, because hydrogen is the most common element in the universe, but do you know what I mean? In order to liquefy hydrogen, in order to use it for cars and trucks and industrial applications, whatever, you need an incredible amount of energy, right? That's a very energy intensive process. Well, we can do that, with cheap energy. And so, again, I think this idea that, to me, it's just a lack of imagination. I think it's a lack of guts and a lack of imagination. And trusting a person who's committed their entire adult life or the last 20 years to destroying something to then be the catalyst for that thing to work and be good in the future, to me, is an incredible leap of faith that I'm frankly not willing to take.
Yeah, I think like Danielle Smith is very vocal about how nervous she is if he does become the prime minister, and she's made these demands, and I have a lot of respect for her. Like she was on your show, and I think she's fantastic. She definitely sticks up for Alberta, and I actually saw, like, to kind of pivot back to housing a little bit, that she posted today that Alberta has they have more housing starts than Ontario has, and Ontario has 3x the population.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's
I
just
mean,
sad. It's sad. Doug Ford has really failed Ontario quite badly. He's more worried about building spas than he is, building homes like he promised.
I mean, I
I
can't
know
speak to that.
the spa is like this scandal, but it's sad to see, right? It shows you when you get out of the way and you remove red tape and you green light projects, things can happen in this country. But when you gatekeep stuff and you have NIMBYism and you don't allow for energy resources to build pipelines or whatever it might be, then you have this lagging productivity effect, and you have a lost decade.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, so I mean, when we talk about productivity, I think a lot of people kind of get their back up and they think, oh, well, I work really hard at work, and it's like, yeah, you do. You probably do. Some of you don't. Some of you do. And
You
but
work for
when
the
you're thinking
government, you
about
mean?
it, at like a top line, like if you're a central banker, like Carolyn Rogers, when she thinks about it, I wouldn't put myself anywhere near that level of sophistication, but a couple notches down where I think about it, you think about like you have your labor force and you need to marry that labor force with an adequate amount of capital. And like capital comes in all different types and forms, right? Capital could be intellectual. We talked about this in software, intellectual property, machine, equipment, blah, blah, blah. But you need that other piece to marry that with the population or labor force, and that creates GDP and hopefully an increase in GDP per capita. And so we've talked a lot about energy, but it's not just energy, right? It's encouraging all forms of investment, right? They wanted to raise the capital gains tax. I mean, what are we doing? That's cap. They want to tax capital. They wanted, things like the carbon tax, right? It's not just about cars, and it's about the input costs to when you're running a manufacturing business or any kind of industry or whatever, right? And so those are friction. That just creates more and more and more friction, and that friction. Well, we're competing against 100 other countries in the world, or whatever it is, 200 countries in the world, and people and capital, for now until they invent central bank digital currency, can move freely, and so there needs to be much more sort of a broader view of what we're doing and how we're doing it, rather than sort of like ideology is the only thing that matters and everyone else be damned.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we're definitely on the same page with that. So I know you manage money for people, and I'll plug your channel down
Well,
below,
my
but
boss does.
your boss
I'm
does.
I'm I'm part of the investment committee. Yeah.
Okay, you're part
I
of the
don't, sorry,
investment.
regulate. That's very important. We don't
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
run
So,
afoul of the regulate.
yeah. Where are
IceCap
you?
manages money for family, and I'm part of the investment team.
You're part of the investment team. Okay. So where are you guys, like in a sense, like how pivotal is this election for you in terms of if you guys, I assume you guys are probably investing more abroad because there's better returns. How pivotal would this election be for you guys to bring some capital back? Where are you looking for opportunities? Where should people
So I
listening to this show
can't
look?
really
You can't
answer
really
that
say, okay,
question
okay, that's fair.
because I can't provide investment advice, but I can talk sort of around it if that's okay.
Sectors or yeah, anything that you can kind
So
of.
if you forgive me for being sort of so cagey, but
No,
it's
no,
it's
you
really
got your
important that
job's more important than
I
this podcast.
I don't want to get in trouble. But let's just say for us, the real issue is let's take it like from first principles. Like people want to invest in countries that are growing.
Mhm.
And in order to grow, those countries need to facilitate growth. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, destroying all regulation. I don't want arsenic in my talcum powder. I think that people should be paid a fair wage and, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not trying to say,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it should be an absolute free for all. What I think is important to recognize is that we've gone too far one way. I think it's very difficult to argue the opposite of that. And I think if you want to encourage people to invest in a country, you need to facilitate and provide incentives for that investment to come. And one way that manifests is the currency, right? So if you buy more assets of a particular country, then that, it's basically supply demand. You increase your demand, and then the currency will go up. So one place where we're a little bit concerned is, if we continue to have structurally a decline in productivity growth, which is what we have right now, by the way, and in a world where Canada has some of the highest debt levels in the world. No, sorry, that was a shitty sentence, but you get what I mean. Like as a percentage of GDP, Canada is one of the most indebted countries in the world. That means inflation will be high. That means interest rates will necessarily have to stay high. And that puts even more pressure on growth. And it's sort of like a vicious circle, right? And so in that world, one of the ways that kind of weakness or that malaise is sort of expressed is in the currency. And so that's something we think a lot about. Now that might take, a while to happen, but that's something we're really concerned and something that we think about a lot when we allocate money for our clients. Is that fair?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think
Can
I
I
said
can
that
I
in a
can I
pretty
touch on
way.
that? So you're looking at the CAD versus USD. And
I didn't say that. You
okay.
said that.
I think Rich is talking about the CAD versus the
I
USD.
didn't. I
So
didn't say
if you
that.
guys are worried that no, I'm not putting words in your mouth. I think that people should be worried that the CAD is going to decline versus the USD, which will
Well,
make.
it's not just USD, right? So that's important also to note.
Okay,
It's like,
euros.
if you look at Canadian dollars basically at a 20-year low versus the US dollar, but it's continuing to fall against everybody else. And, you know, I mean, that's an indictment on your economy. It's telling you something's wrong.
Hmm.
And the question we have is, are we going to change direction or not? And if we're about to usher in the same old crew to do the same old thing, then we're going to get the same results, right? I think fundament. And so that's our view.
Okay.
Now, again, to reiterate, I don't, a new person come in and might, they won't be able to. There's very few saviors in life, you know what I mean? Like,
Right. Right.
but we think there needs to be at least, we need to arrest the decline first, and then we'll think about the future later.
Yeah, it's you remember how Pierre was he was like exploring Bitcoin with some people, and then the House of Commons came at him, and Trudeau came at him all the time, and now that people making fun of him for Bitcoin has gone away, because obviously Bitcoin has been one of the best performing assets of the last 5 or 10 years
Yeah,
or
but
whatever. No,
but
I'm not saying invest in Bitcoin. I'm just saying like
no, well, I think
with
it was a mistake for him to. I mean, so yes, you are technically right that had you bought Bitcoin when he said it, you would be doing very well. I don't think it's the prime minister or any politician's job to tell anybody to buy any
what to do
assets
and buy.
ever.
Yeah, yeah,
I think that was a mistake, and I think if you spoke to Pierre quietly in a corner somewhere, he'd probably say, "Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that." Does
yeah.
that
I
make
agree with
sense?
you. Yeah, that makes sense.
No,
I think
not that
with
he was obviously right, but
yeah.
he was still kind of wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think my grand point was that there was a politician who was, in cabinet thinking that our currency should debase, so I should
Yeah,
hedge by buying Bitcoin. And when he released his holdings, he still owned
yeah,
a bunch of Bitcoin in an
yeah.
ETF. So it was interesting to see that. You
To
could
me,
argue
the
that.
far more insane comment was Justin Trudeau saying that there's no case for natural gas. Like,
Yeah,
to me, that there's no business case for natural
for
gas.
natural gas. Yeah.
That to me is like an almost unforgivable sin for two reasons. One, it's absurd. He was totally freaking wrong,
Mhm.
and people will come around and say, "Well, that's not really what he meant." Listen, that's what they meant. They don't want to exploit oil and gas. That's it. They've made that very clear, and they have a history of policy efforts and litigation, and that's clear. They hate oil and gas. They want to destroy that industry. I don't think anybody could disagree with that. The reason why I thought it was particularly unforgivable is because you remember at the time Russia had just invaded, and oil price, excuse me, natural gas had tripled, right? Almost in some cases quadrupled in price. And unlike Canada, where we have other sources of natural energy, excuse me, where hydro in Quebec and nuclear power in Ontario and coal in Nova Scotia, many European countries and Japan rely hugely on natural gas. And so for our allies to come to Canada and basically beg our prime minister to turn on the taps and for him to tell them to get lost, climate change was to me insane and
Mhm.
totally unforgivable. Right. So much for solidarity against the Russians and NATO and all the rest of that shit. He should have said, screw climate change. We're going to help our NATO allies, Poland, Greece, and Germany. And we're going to get natural gas as fast as we can and as much as we can to you tomorrow. And then Japan obviously is not a NATO ally, but they're an ally in other ways, etc. Right.
Mhm.
So those are the four countries that came, and we told them to get lost. And so to me, that's why it was particularly jarring to hear him say that, and then to everyone fall in line and support that view, and then make excuses for him and blah blah blah. It was insane. It was insane.
Yeah, it's crazy to look back on even.
Like, it was insane at the time, by the way. I think, and then obviously, and then the other thing that's really critical. Sorry, I could go on and on about energy forever because I think it's really important, especially right now, is that nearly all of our natural gas exports go to the U.S. Right?
Or
So like,
yeah, we're trying to
right. So
we're trying to get new trading partners
all this
and
bullshit about having new trading partners. Well, had we just done the ethically and moral right thing 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we would have had new trading partners. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, we would have new customers.
Well, and it's, natural gas is not the be all end all, but to me, it really sort of typifies the this attitude, right? This attitude that no matter how much pain domestically we're going to impose on our citizens or other people in the world, we need to keep it in the ground. And that's we can't do that. We can't do that
Yeah.
in a world, in the new world that we're in. We're in a new world, and that can't exist.
Well, that could have just been a quick tell on where Rich is looking at investing money, but I won't just point that out.
No,
But I guess, Rich, I'm coming up on an hour here. I just wanted to
sure.
ask, where do you think, what are a few things you think that Canadians should think about going into this, pretty crucial election in what, 2 weeks? What do you think they should be thinking about?
I mean, I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about whether or not there's a sufficient amount of self reflection that's been had on the team that got us here. Honest to goodness self reflection, not we're going to do this just to get over the finish line and then immediately turn our back on everything we've just finished promising. And I think that the other thing that I think about is, you know, I genuinely believe that Canada has everything it needs to be successful. We have a decent institutions. We have we have a good value system. I don't believe in this nonsense that Canada doesn't have a culture. I disagree profoundly.
I hate
I
that too.
I hate that with
Yeah.
as the son of immigrants, two immigrants to Canada that love Canada, and
Me too. Me too.
I think that to say that is a slap in the face to every single person who's
Built
paid
this country
taxes,
up. Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
loved this country, who's built this country. To say that Canada is a post-national state, I think is asinine. I don't believe that. I think Canada is worth fighting for. And it was worth fighting for, by the way, before Donald Trump came, and it'll be worth fighting for when Donald Trump goes away.
Mhm.
And I think that we need to stop being so divisive. And I think that and then more importantly, I think that the opportunity set is laid out in front of us. It is crystal clear what we should do from an opportunity set. We need to build things, and we need the government to get out of the way. And we need to allow the private sector to invest in Canada. And then we need to hold that private sector to account rather than the other way around. And so what I mean by that is like, you know, ensure that people are getting paid right, ensure that that they're not polluting rivers, and ensure sort of all those little basics, but otherwise basically get out of the way. And I think that if Canada really does that and leans in and sort of owns up to what it can be and should be, I think that's my personal view, that I think Canada can have a great century. I think if we continue to sacrifice the standard of living of working class people to meet some great global goal, I think Canada's going to give me in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, the goal of people who make these goals and fly on private jets is
And
something that
never feel any of
the
they
repercussions.
don't, they just simply
They
don't.
don't.
I mean,
Yeah,
they just
it's
simply, I
mind
mean,
blowing.
you cannot convince me that those people ever feel the negative impact of their decisions. They
No,
don't.
they never do. No.
And all I really, as like, I come from working class stock. Like, yeah, I went to fancy schools. Okay, I'll concede that. But I know where I came from, and what matters is those meat and potatoes things, And like I'm sort of done with all those like grand ideology pursuing. And I want working class people to have hope and to have good places to live and to go to decent schools, and all this sort of boring stuff is what I really, really care about.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's
No, I think
maybe I've
I
crossed the line in what I've said over
no,
the
no,
last hour, but that's I
no,
hope
I
I'm off.
I think that's a genuine thing, and I've been following the Loonie Hour for a long time, and you guys have been consistent on the same message, just about, the middle class being wiped out, or just basic messaging of let's get productivity going. Housing's too expensive. Like even me as a realtor, people are always like, "You're so annoying. You always say housing's too expensive," and I'm like, "Yeah, well, it is. Like, I don't agree that housing should be this expensive for people's incomes. I don't agree that people need to call their parents and ask them to co-sign on a mortgage, that
At
is
35 and
30.
40 years old, by the way.
Yeah, like yeah, it's like I think it's crazy that people can't just have one of the most beautiful things. I'm not saying everyone has to have this, but have children. Like there's so many women who I talk to and they're just so sad that they can't afford a child, and it breaks my heart. And that's
Well,
why I want
I mean, that's a really interesting. Maybe next time we chat, we'll talk more about that because I think that's a fascinating thing that people have gotten completely backwards.
100%. And I understand that there's people in this world who don't want kids. Don't
Yeah,
get me
that's
wrong, but
fine.
that's
Good.
fine. Like that you do your thing. I get it. But the women that do, and like when I
And the
finally
men that
see
do, they
the
feel
men
like
that
they
do, yeah,
can't afford, like they feel like they can't afford, forget a mansion,
yeah.
just like a
A
small
wartime
three
home.
bedroom
Yeah.
home.
Yeah. With a little backyard they can run around with their dog and their kid in. Like it's
And like
just
what's actually really fascinating is that there's actually loads and loads of research to support this view. So it's like because it's like a hot take. It's a little bit ephemeral, you know. It's like it's this idea. It's like, oh, how do if you build it, then like birth rates are falling everywhere in the world. Okay, that's fine. We get that. But the birth rates are falling faster and have fallen further in places where they have really, really expensive housing and people
yeah.
can't feel like it. And so, but so, and in my view, some governments have gotten this backwards. So, like, oh, birth rates are falling. We need immigration. And it's totally, that's
No,
like been
yeah.
totally backwards.
You're
Like,
so
okay,
right.
again, to be clear, my parents are immigrants. I don't think immigration writ large is a negative. Okay. I don't want any freaking, don't at me.
Yeah.
I'm saying tripling the number was a mistake.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And maybe we should have been focused on making life easier for young working families rather than importing a workforce. That's
I agree.
all I'm saying. Like there are, I mean, to me, maybe we talk, people talk about how do you encourage families? Like, well, okay, maybe if you have two kids, you don't pay taxes until you're 50,
Yeah.
or or I don't know, or the other thing. The thing is like let's talk about women for a second. Like women get shafted when they're in working. So I know lots of really smart, really hardworking, super well-educated women, excuse me, who want to have children, but they're in a situation where they have to basically make a decision between their career and babies. And I'm like, we need to get around that.
Yeah.
We need to be able to like maybe women shouldn't have to pay taxes or if they work or you know what I mean? I don't know, something where we can encourage them. Yeah, you want to have a career, fine. You want to take 2 years out to have a baby, fine. But you shouldn't be penalized for basically keeping civilization afloat. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
No, I agree. I think it's a great idea for every child you have. Like you get 25% off your
or I don't
tax
know,
bracket, or I don't know. I don't know the
something. But
right.
like, I know there's like one of my very dear friends. I've known this woman. I won't say her name, but I've known this woman for 20 years. I mean, she took maternity leave, and now she's being passed up for promotions. That's bullshit,
Yeah.
as far as I'm concerned.
I agree. No, 100%. I
Do you know what I
agree.
mean? And like the fact, like she's literally keeping civilization. Human. I mean, I like humans mostly, most of
Yeah.
them, anyways.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like she should not be punished by her company, which by the way I'm certain has like a whole DEI department, by the way.
Yeah. I was going to
She
say
should not
that
be
word, but
punished for basically making the most like one of the most beautiful decisions that you can make, which is to have children. And so that's something I think we really need to get around as a society. Like and if, listen, you don't have kids, fine, but let's park that for a second. Let's just think about
Mhm.
the women who do and who also want to be contributing members and have a lot to offer as managers, scientists, doctors, fuck whatever they want to do. Or if they want to work at Dairy Queen, that's great too. You know what I mean? But like the
Mhm.
point is we need to, that to me is like something we really need to work on because it's not working right now. It's broken.
I agree. We need to incentivize, or, not even incentivize, make it affordable for women to have kids if they want. I'm not,
Well, they shouldn't be punished for it. And
yeah.
I think that a lot of women I know that I speak to feel punished. They're feeling the by doing this thing that they're worse off, and that's fucked. And I
Yeah,
think that that's completely it's unfair. It's bad for society, and I think there are some really straightforward fixes to that
I
thing.
agree. I agree too. And bring it back to the housing is that, I'm in a condo right now as we're speaking, right? Like it's not viable for me to bring two kids into this world in a condo and people will say, "Oh, just work harder, just work hard." Trust me, I work and
Oh,
I make good money. But looking at, where I wanted to live in my hometown, which is outside of Toronto, to get a townhouse there is 1.1, 1.2 million. Like that's a lot of money for a three-bedroom
yeah.
townhouse. Like that, I'll move to another province. Well, then my business dissolves because this I've been doing this for 10 years here and I have to do it all over
Right.
again somewhere
So
else. So
yeah, I mean, we aren't, our generation is not without blame.
for sure.
So I think that there's something to be said for like owning up to that. I think, frankly, a lot of boys and girls think they can have it all. That's just not life. We got to make sacrifices.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned moving. I think we need to be more open. We need to be, in general, more amenable to moving to places that are cheaper. I think we need to be more comfortable in living in smaller homes
Yeah.
in general, full stop. And the reason I say that is because a home 50 years ago was 900 square feet and they had 12 kids.
Yeah.
And homes
They
today
all
are
shared
three.
one bathroom.
Well, I'm just saying that
Yeah.
today homes are 5,000 square feet and they have one kid. No, I'm
Yeah.
exaggerating to
Yeah.
make the
Yeah.
point. I'm not saying we should just accept mediocrity. I'm saying we need to meet the moment halfway is what I'm trying to say, right?
No,
I'm not
I
trying to
hear you. I hear
I'm
you.
not trying to
Yeah.
dismiss. We know each other well enough. I'm not trying to just dismiss people's complaints. If anything, I think we need to complain more. However, there are certain things we as this generation should we need to meet the moment a little bit too. But in general, yes, I agree.
Yeah, yeah. I think even the wartime bungalow, if that was built in the 1950s, the fact that that's $1 million is just like it's just
Uh,
crazy, right?
well,
Like it's
that's I
just
mean, fundamentally, that is the issue. I mean,
yeah.
I'm trying to paint a more nuanced picture because I'm also trying to sort of head off any of the criticism off at the past, and I'm trying to confront that before
Mhm.
we
We
get
get
it.
it. Yeah.
But you can't 10x your income,
No.
and it's gross income before
Yeah. Before
taxes,
taxes.
right? And
Property
and and
taxes.
it's household income. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Right. So
Hmm.
it's gross. You have a gross household income of $300,000, and you still can't afford a decent place to live.
It yeah, and they just
What are
keep
we doing here?
yeah, drive till you can afford it is
And then
the
and then people say, well, why aren't you having kids? It's like, well,
I got to
to
service my
me,
mortgage and then
it's
I got
it's
to
it's a real. I
yeah.
mean, to me, it's a real indictment. I think one of the things that we maybe we'll finish where we started. One of the things that I think really really aggravates me is the lack of empathy um, towards young people who really really are struggling. And I wouldn't consider, I love my job. There's a lot of visibility and what I genuinely think, hopefully one day things will work out for me financially and blah blah blah. But there's a lot of people who aren't so fortunate, and it's not okay. It's not, it has not been okay.
Mhm.
And I think the gaslighting, the whitewashing of the economic record, it's old, baby. It's over. It's not okay.
Yeah.
In order to improve this country, we need to recognize where we are, and we're in a shitty state. And that doesn't mean we can't be amazing. We will be amazing. There's lots of great people who live there, and I know if we all started rowing in the same direction, get there. But to pretend like everything's great now is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's wrap it up there. And let's keep that for the next topic too. We can
Sure.
talk about like housing and the birth rate and stuff like that. I think it's an interesting topic for a lot of people because yeah, I feel like what our generation kind of does is it's better just to ignore it than to talk about it, which kind of sucks. But that's
Well,
why I like having,
people don't want to offend the sensibilities.
yeah, I
People
know.
people don't want to talk about that women over the age of 40 have an incredibly difficult time getting
Having
pregnant.
children, yeah, it's
I'm 40 years old. I'm surrounded by women who are my friends who I've known for 20 years who've had a really hard time financially. They've had to spend a lot of money. There's a lot of heartbreak involved. Maybe we'll skip the details of that. And you know they and that's those are real conversations that
yeah,
I
it's
have
like a
with
real
friends
thing.
who
Yeah,
I've known for since college, right? We're
yeah,
all 40. Like I'm a
yeah.
bit older than you. Like all my girlfriends and friends are 40. They're all families. Some of them really, really struggled. And those are real conversations people are having around the dinner table at the bar or whatever it is.
Yeah, I can tell you that, actually being there, I'm 31. All my buddies are the same age, and a few of them are, they're one just had a baby, others are trying. We're all, at the bar having a beer talking about, yeah, this is the time we got to do it because our girlfriends are the same age. So
Yeah.
you have to dive in because there is a biological clock. Like that's a real thing. So
Yeah.
it
Until
exists.
five
Yeah.
minutes
Like,
ago, by the way, until 5 minutes ago, that was not a controversial
yeah,
statement.
like everyone who's in their 30s is thinking, or 40s is thinking about, I don't have much time left to do this, have kids and do these things that I want to do. I have to do it
Obviously.
soon. Yeah, like
Right.
it's not an offensive thing to
Well, it
say.
shouldn't
It's
be. It shouldn't be
reality. It
in a
shouldn't be. Yeah.
normal world, in a normal world, but we're not in a normal world.
No,
We're in
we're
the
not.
upside down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
We're in the
again, if
upside
you don't
down
want to have
where,
kids, that's it doesn't
yeah,
matter. We're
fine.
talking about the people who want to have kids.
Yeah,
Like we're talking
yeah.
about those people.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in the upside down where old people are supposed to be happy and young people are supposed to eat shit. And in my world, that's bizarre, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
But
Anyways,
anyway,
Rich, you are a voice for the young people. Everyone, you
I
do
don't know,
not give
man.
yourself enough credit. You're too
Uh,
modest. You're very smart. You have a lot of data to back up your points. You should be very proud of how much
well,
you've
thank you very
accomplished.
much.
And
Appreciate the opportunity and the platform to share my views.
you have an
Yeah,
amazing platform. And I'm going to link down his YouTube channel. I love it. I watch it every time you put one out.
cool. Thank
I
you.
always see your
Yes,
head
the
come up on
ice
my.
cap Canadian market wrap.
Yeah,
There
Ice
you
Cap Canadian Market Rap, and you gotta listen to the Loonie Hour. Keith is a boomer, but he's a cool boomer, and he gives great, some terrible jokes, but he's very smart. And
Terrible
so is Steve.
jokes.
Steve is very smart with housing. He's done a great job too. So you guys have all different backgrounds. It's awesome to listen to. So I'll link them both below. And yeah, let us know what you guys think. Like, are me and Rich just crazy, to lunch, or are you guys agreeing with what we have to say? Anyways, like, subscribe, all the good stuff. Rich, thanks again for coming on. You are the first time I've had a returning guest, so I appreciate it.
Thank you very much again for the
All right.
opportunity.
Thanks for watching, guys.